Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the Tunguska event of 1908. Picture a map of northern Asia so wide it swallows the horizon. Now zoom in on a patch of central Siberia that, in 1908, was more wilderness than world. This is Evenki country, taiga forests, rivers like coiled silver, and communities who knew the land intimately but saw few visitors from Russia's distant cities. If you were living in St. Petersburg or Moscow back then, Tunguska may as well have been on the far side of the moon. That remoteness is not a backdrop, it is a character in our story. Let's talk infrastructure, because in Tsarist Russia the roads did not simply lead everywhere, they often led nowhere. Rail lines were sparse in this region, wagon tracks turned to swamps in summer and ice in winter, and telegraph lines felt like fragile spiderwebs stretched across a continent. Imagine trying to coordinate a scientific expedition across that. If news traveled at the speed of a horse, evidence aged at the speed of decay. Fallen trees, scorched brush, eyewitness memories, all of it would be changing while the message was even being sent. And the science of the time? Early 20th century researchers were brilliant and curious, but they were not space-age meteor detectives. The very language we use today, airbursts, shock fronts, impact physics, was still being invented. Most people's framework for things falling from the sky came from folklore, a handful of famous meteorite falls, and newspaper exaggeration. If someone in a distant village said, "The sky split," that was a clue. But how do you fit it into a model that barely exists yet? Now add the human factor, investigation barriers. You have a remote region that is hard to reach, a state whose priorities are focused elsewhere, and a scientific community without instant communication or aerial surveys. In practical terms, that means delays, months, even years. Each week that passes after a dramatic event is like turning down the volume on nature's evidence. Ash washes away. Trees fall for ordinary reasons. People tell the story a little differently each time around the stove at night. Can you hear how the mystery begins to thicken? Not because someone is hiding something, but because the world is big, messy, and hard to measure. So, when we ask why Tunguska became such a long-running puzzle, the first answer is not a conspiracy. It's geography, it's infrastructure, it's timing. The Evenki heartland kept its secrets well. The Tsar's limited roads and telegraphs slowed the chase. And the scientific tools of the day, the ones we now take for granted, weren't yet in the kit. All of that sets the stage for everything that follows. Hold that picture in your mind, an immense, beautiful, stubborn landscape, thin lines of communication, and investigators who will have to fight distance, weather, and the calendar itself. Because in Tunguska, the setting isn't just where the story happens. The setting is why the story is hard to tell. The morning of June 30th, 1908. It begins like any other in the endless green of central Siberia. The sun has barely risen, the air is still cool, and the forests stretch in every direction like an ocean of pine. But then, it happens. First, a blinding flash, not a flicker, not a lightning bolt that vanishes in a heartbeat, but a searing light so intense it could be seen hundreds of miles away. Imagine you're an Evenki hunter on the banks of the Podkamenia Tunguska River, or a settler in a small cabin. You glance up, and the sky is no longer the sky. It's white-hot daylight in the wrong place at the wrong time. People later said it was as if the heavens themselves cracked open. And then comes the shockwave. You don't just hear it, you feel it in your bones. This was no ordinary explosion. Scientists estimate the energy release at between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT. That's not just numbers on paper. That's a force strong enough to flatten 80 million trees across more than 2,000 square kilometers. Try to picture it, the forest bowing down in a single, terrible gesture, trunks snapped like matchsticks, branches stripped bare, birds and animals vanish into silence. If you were close enough, you'd be thrown to the ground. If you were farther away, you'd still feel it like a giant's fist striking the earth. Eyewitnesses struggled to describe it. Some spoke of the sky splitting in two. Others said it felt like standing in front of an open oven, with heat rushing toward them in an invisible wave. There were delayed thunderclaps, rumbling across the taiga like distant artillery fire. No one had the words for meteor airburst. They only had comparisons to what they knew: heat, light, thunder, and fear. And yet, perhaps the strangest detail of all, no crater. You expect a blast of this size to gouge a scar into the land, to leave a hollow that swallows ponds and trees. But when the smoke cleared and later expeditions arrived, the ground was still there, blackened, yes, but unbroken. The trees pointed outward from a central zone, like spokes on a wheel, but there was no smoking pit at the hub. For the early investigators, this was maddening. How do you explain a cataclysm without an obvious point of impact? So by midday, the damage was done. Millions of trees lay prostrate, animals lay dead, the air still shimmered with heat, and yet the cause was hidden in plain sight, somewhere above them. It was as if the earth had been struck by something it could not hold onto, leaving only the aftermath as proof it had ever happened. So, what did the scientists eventually decide had happened in that remote Siberian wilderness? Over the decades, one explanation rose to the top: the mainstream meteor hypothesis. Picture a stony meteorite, or perhaps a fragment of a comet, hurtling through space at tens of thousands of miles per hour. It's been traveling for who knows how long, maybe since the dawn of the solar system, until fate puts it on a collision course with Earth. As it barrels into our atmosphere, the friction and pressure become unimaginable. But here's the key: it doesn't survive the trip all the way down. Somewhere between 5 and 10 kilometers above the ground, the object breaks apart violently. In an instant, all that kinetic energy is unleashed in a superheated explosion, an airburst. The energy was staggering. We're talking 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, comparable to a large thermonuclear device, released in a flash. That's enough to flatten those 80 million trees we talked about, without ever touching the ground. No crater, because there was no direct impact. Just an immense wave of heat and pressure radiating outward, snapping trees and scorching the forest floor. And the scientists didn't just imagine this. They compared it to something more recent: the Chelyabinsk meteor in 2013. That was a much smaller event, but it still exploded high in the atmosphere over Russia, shattering windows, injuring more than 1,000 people, and leaving no crater. The parallels were compelling: mid-air detonation, shockwave damage, blinding light, and scattered debris so fine that it left little trace on the ground. Chelyabinsk gave modern researchers a kind of living laboratory to test the Tunguska model. In this view, everything fits neatly: the blast zone's radial pattern, the absence of a crater, the eyewitness accounts of heat and light, even the timing of delayed thunderclaps. The airburst theory ties it together with a single, dramatic cause: a visitor from space that self-destructed before it could hit the Earth. Of course, neatly is a relative term. Science is always provisional, built on evidence and probability. And while this explanation satisfied many, it didn't stop others from wondering, what if it wasn't a meteor at all? Now we step off the paved road of consensus and wander into the tangled, fascinating trails of alternative theories. Because for some researchers, and plenty of curious minds, the Tunguska event was just too strange, too unique, to be explained by a single meteor exploding in the sky. Let's start with one of the most famous names in science history: Nikola Tesla. Some have speculated, without hard proof, but with a lot of imagination, that Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, his experimental wireless power transmission facility in New York, might have been testing a directed energy beam. In this theory, a test gone wrong, or perhaps gone exactly as planned, sent a massive burst of energy halfway across the globe, striking Siberia with devastating force. The idea sounds wild, and it is, but it taps into the mystique of Tesla as a man whose genius sometimes outpaced his era's understanding of safety, and maybe even ethics. Then there's the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Here, we're talking about the possibility of an alien spacecraft crashing, or conducting some kind of atmospheric test, over remote Siberia. Supporters point to the fact that Tunguska left no crater, suggesting a controlled detonation or disintegration rather than an uncontrolled fall from space. It's a theory that lives at the edge of science and science fiction, but it continues to inspire both UFO researchers and storytellers alike. Geophysical theories take a more earthbound route. Some suggest a sudden eruption of methane gas from beneath the surface, ignited by lightning or other natural sparks, could have produced a massive explosion. Others imagine a comet whose nucleus was mostly ice, which would vaporize before hitting the ground, releasing tremendous energy but leaving behind little or no solid debris. And then there's the anomalous evidence, the little details that don't seem to fit perfectly anywhere. Unusual tree fall patterns that hint at multiple shockwave centers. Reports of strange magnetic disturbances in the aftermath. The conspicuous absence of meteor fragments that, if present, might have settled the debate long ago. These theories don't have the same weight of evidence as the meteor model, but they persist because they keep the mystery alive. They remind us that history is not just a record of what we know, it's also a record of what we wonder about. And in the case of Tunguska, there's still a lot to wonder. By the time serious investigations into Tunguska began, nearly 2 decades had passed. It was 1927 when Soviet scientist Leonid Kulik finally made his way into the blast zone. Imagine trekking through miles of swamp, dense forest, and mosquito-filled air, carrying not just equipment but the weight of expectation. Kulik had read the reports, heard the rumors, and he was convinced he would find a massive crater filled with meteorite fragments. Instead, he found something stranger: millions of trees flattened in a radial pattern, their trunks stripped of branches, pointing away from a central point, but no crater at all. Kulik's expedition was a scientific mission, but it unfolded in a political climate that shaped what could be said and how it could be said. The Soviet Union was in its early years, and science was expected to align with state ideology. This meant investigations often carried an undercurrent of propaganda, proof of Soviet scientific prowess, narratives that fit neatly into Marxist interpretations of history, and an eagerness to show the world that the USSR could solve mysteries that others could not. As the decades passed, the Cold War cast an even longer shadow over the Tunguska story. Access to the region, to archives, and to international collaboration became tightly controlled. Some findings might have been downplayed or reinterpreted to avoid fueling foreign speculation. And in a time when both the United States and the Soviet Union were testing nuclear weapons and exploring the possibilities of missile defense, a massive unexplained explosion in the atmosphere wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was a case study in military vulnerability. The space race brought a renewed interest in Tunguska, too. As scientists and engineers began sending rockets into orbit, the idea of extraterrestrial hazards gained practical urgency. Could a similar event destroy a city? Could it be predicted, prevented? Or, more cynically, could knowledge of such an event be leveraged for strategic advantage? In the Cold War mindset, even nature's mysteries became tools in the great geopolitical game. So, while the image of Kulik standing among the shattered trees has become iconic, it's important to remember the layers beneath it. The Soviet investigation wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was shaped by ambition, ideology, secrecy, and the high-stakes politics of a world split between superpowers. In other words, Tunguska's mystery was not just a scientific puzzle, it was a Cold War story in its own right. When you look at Tunguska, it's tempting to focus on the what, the flash, the shockwave, the theories. But there's an equally important question we should ask: what does this event teach us about the relationship between science, power, and the stories we tell? First, there's the limit of evidence. In an ideal world, science works like a neat equation: you gather the data, you form a hypothesis, and you test it until you're certain. But in real life, especially in historical cases like Tunguska, the evidence is incomplete, scattered, and sometimes gone before anyone arrives. The physical record is not a perfect library, it's more like a few pages from a burned book. That means conclusions are always provisional, and what we think we know today could change with one new discovery tomorrow. Then there's political filtering. Whether it's Tsarist Russia with its limited infrastructure or the Soviet Union with its ideological gatekeeping, information about Tunguska has never flowed in a purely objective stream. Who funds the investigation? Who controls the archives? Who decides which findings are published and which quietly vanish into a filing cabinet? These are not small questions. The flow of knowledge often depends on the priorities of people in power, and history shows that those priorities don't always align with transparency. And that brings us to the value of independence. Independent researchers, often underfunded, sometimes working in isolation, have kept the Tunguska story alive in ways that large institutions sometimes haven't. When centralized systems slow down or narrow the scope of inquiry, it's often these individuals who push the conversation forward, ask uncomfortable questions, and keep alternative explanations from being forgotten. Finally, there's the matter of historical parallels. If we zoom out, Tunguska is not the only case where an unexplained event meets political interests, limited evidence, and contested narratives. We've seen similar patterns in industrial disasters, wartime incidents, and even modern scientific debates. The specifics differ, but the underlying lesson remains: facts are fragile things when they travel through layers of power. So, Tunguska isn't just a story about a mysterious explosion in Siberia. It's a case study in how knowledge is built, and sometimes bent, by the systems around it. And it's a reminder that if we want the clearest possible picture of the past, we have to understand not only the events themselves but the forces shaping how those events are remembered. We've walked through the forests of Siberia, stood in the blast zone with Kulik, and weighed the theories from meteors to Tesla. And yet, more than a century later, Tunguska still refuses to hand over all its secrets. That, in itself, is part of its power. The truth is, we may never have absolute certainty. The lack of a crater, the absence of large meteor fragments, and the decades-long delay in reaching the site mean some questions will remain unanswered. Was it truly a stony meteor exploding in the upper atmosphere? Could it have been a comet's icy heart vaporizing before impact? Or was it something far stranger, lying outside our current understanding of physics, geology, or even human history? But here's why this mystery matters today. Events like Tunguska are not confined to history books. Similar atmospheric explosions have happened in modern times, Chelyabinsk being the most famous example, and the potential for another, larger event is not a question of if, but when. Our preparedness, our ability to detect, and our willingness to act could one day determine whether such an event is a fascinating story or a global disaster. And beyond the science, Tunguska challenges us to think about how we handle the unknown. Do we rush to the most convenient explanation and close the case? Do we keep asking questions, even when the trail is cold? Do we let political or institutional interests shape the narrative, or do we demand a clearer, fuller picture? The Tunguska event is, in the end, a mirror. It reflects our curiosity, our limitations, and our tendency to weave stories from incomplete evidence. And maybe that's its most valuable lesson, that history isn't just what happened. It's also how we search for what happened. If you enjoyed exploring this mystery with me, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. And if you want to go even deeper, check out my book History They Tried to Erase, link in the description. You'll find more stories where the official record is just the beginning. And as always, if you love thoughtful, entertaining history, there's plenty more waiting for you here on Truth Behind History.